Ancient Greece. It is one of the most influential cultures to come out of the Mediterranean in the ancient world, and that's saying something because these are all foundational cultures that we have been studying. But the Greeks laid the foundation for Western culture, for Western European culture, and this affects us here in the United States directly, in that many of our concepts, our political thoughts, our culture, our taste in everything from literature to music to art reflect roots in Greek culture. But they also represent a sort of a shift from the cultures of the ancient Mediterranean in the way they approach the concept of the individual, the concept of the human being, and the way human beings are represented in ancient Greek art. Because of this, shows a significant shift from everything that had come before. So let's take a look at where the Greeks lived, and let's talk a little bit about their culture. The Greeks lived in a place that we've already studied, an area called the Aegean. Greece itself is a little isthmus that sticks out here into the Aegean. By the time the Greeks settled here, though, the ancient cultures of the Mycenaean, the Minoan, and the Cycladic cultures had been long gone. Around 1200 BCE, a period we call the Greek Dark Ages begins. And this lasts until around 800 or so BCE. And it is in this sort of 400-year period that the Greeks, who actually did not refer to themselves as Greeks, but instead called themselves Hellenes, where these Hellenic peoples settled in this area that had been occupied by these older cultures. So this new people come in and settle and kind of begin their own culture, although building on top of these previous ancient cultures. So the Greeks are aware of, the palaces of Knossos. They're aware of the fortress cities of Mycenae, and many of the historical events from these ancient cultures actually form sort of the roots of Greek literature. The great epics written by the Greek poet Homer in the 8th century, the Iliad and the Odyssey, are based in stories that come from this pre-Hellenic period. The Greeks themselves lived in a bunch of city-states. An individual city-state is called a polis, P-O-L-I-S. These city-states were very much like the Sumerian city-states. Greece wasn't a unified nation or empire. It's not like Egypt. It's not a monoculture with one sort of ruling class and this sort of consolidated empire. It is a series of city-states, often with very different worldviews and very different ways of ruling themselves and very different outlooks and attitudes. And this often left to the Greek city-states fighting amongst themselves. Although when the time came and they needed to band together, as we will talk about, they certainly could. And this was one of the causes of their success and them being able to flourish. However, this infighting eventually led to the Greeks' downfalls. But so these are a bunch of little city-states. Like you got Athens, and you have Sparta, and you have Corinth, and you have Olympia, and you have all of these little city-states. The city-state we'll be focusing on the most will be Athens, as it is the most influential and in many ways the most sort of Greek in the sense of the kinds of cultural things that are laid down that form the basis of Western culture. A lot of this comes out of Athens. But by 776 BCE, the Greeks saw themselves as a people, even though they weren't a nation. And we know this because this is when the first Olympic Games are held. So these city-states which had a common language, which had a common religion, which and had sort of an alliance amongst each other, came to Olympia for this large religious ceremony that was consisted of sporting events and consisted of a musical competition. But what's important here is that they were a unified culture, even though if they weren't unified politically. But it is in Athens that produces some of the great sort of cultural touchstones. I mean, this is sort of the place where Socrates and Plato and Aristotle in the 4th century wrote their foundational books of philosophy that still form the basis of Western thought today. This is the place where the great playwrights Sophocles and Euripides and Aristophanes, for instance, wrote their foundational literature that your English teachers still make you read today. This is also the birthplace of Western democracy. This is where a group of Athenian men decided that the best way to run a society was by allowing everybody, and of course in this case it's male landowners, but that allowed citizens to represent themselves and to vote in a democracy. In fact, democracy is a Greek word coming from the word demos, people, and krasi, meaning to rule. So this rule by people is a Greek invention. And the reason for this sort of Greek obsession, as you will see, with the individual, and this idea that every man sort of deserves to have their own say and their own voice in the way he is ruled, comes from a concept called humanism. Humanism is an idea that was developed slowly throughout Greek society. In the 5th century, a guy named Protagoras said, "Man is the measure of all things." What he was sort of meaning to imply was that man kind of gets to decide their own fate. Man gets to sort of decide their own morality. And this comes from sort of the Greek worldview. The Greeks believed their gods were basically people, just incredibly powerful people. But these Greek gods weren't like the other gods of the ancient world. These weren't sort of man-beast hybrids. These were human-looking gods with problems, with desires, with hatreds, with loves, with inconsistencies. They were basically us. And so this Greek worldview is significantly different than what came before, because this is a human-centered world. This man is the measure of all things means we, human beings, are the measures of ourselves. Not a god, not a king, not a pharaoh, but a human being. And this is completely different than the sort of way human beings viewed themselves before this in the ancient world. In Egypt, the pharaoh is the measure of all things. In other places, it might be an emperor or a king or a priest class, or the gods ultimately are the measures of all things. But in Greece, it's us. So it's an outlook or a system of thought attaching prime importance to human rather than divine or supernatural matters. Humanist beliefs stress the potential value and goodness of human beings, emphasize common human needs, and seek solely rational ways of solving human problems. So what this means is that the human figure is going to occupy a place of primacy in Greek art in a way that it hasn't anywhere else in human history up to the point of the Greeks. And one last thing I want to talk about, speaking about Greek influence, is why the Greeks are so relevant. If you have a look around you, go to a government building, go to Washington, D.C., go to Austin, go to your local courthouse, and you will see the influence of Greek art all around you. This is an image of the U.S. Supreme Court building on the right, and on the left is a building you'll become very familiar with, the Parthenon. And here you can see those similarities. And the reason our founding fathers built Washington, D.C., in the model and the mode of Greek architecture was because the concepts, the central concepts of our democracy, a Greek word, came from the ancient Greeks. And so our founding fathers believed since we modeled our government based on these concepts, we need to model the buildings that the government occupies from that. And then just in another way, we use Greek words all the time in our language. Phrases like Achilles' heel, Midas touch, Pandora's box, Trojan horse. All of these phrases and words come from Greek culture. So it is foundational to Western culture. We're going to divide the Greek world or Greek art, I should say, into 7 distinct periods. The geometric from about 800 to 700 BCE, the Orientalizing or Daedalic from 700 to 600 BCE, the Archaic from 600 to 480, Early Classical from 480 to 450, High Classical 450 to 400, Late Classical 430 to 323, and then finally the Hellenistic period. So without further ado, we're going to get started on our section on ancient Greece here, and I hope you guys enjoy this section as much as I did when I was a student learning about this stuff, because it really does represent a massive sort of sea change in the way human beings decided to represent ourselves. All right, here we go.